Tonight, we're embarking on a harrowing journey through one of history's most catastrophic collapses, when the mighty Roman Empire, master of the known world for centuries, crumbled under waves of barbarian invasions, devastating famines, and complete social breakdown. You'll witness this apocalyptic transformation through the eyes of a battle-hardened veteran, experiencing firsthand how quickly civilization can unravel when order gives way to chaos, abundance turns to starvation, and the very foundations of society dissolve into anarchy. Before we continue deeper into these ancient shadows, take a quiet moment to subscribe if these forgotten stories bring you peace. And if you're still drifting with us, let us know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. It's always fascinating to see who joins us from around the world as we wander through history's quieter moments. This is the true story of ordinary people struggling to survive as their world literally fell apart around them, filled with desperate choices, unlikely heroes, and the brutal realities of imperial collapse. Perhaps you'd like to settle comfortably now, drawing your blankets close as we drift back through the mists of time to an age when the eagle standards of Rome cast their shadows across 3 continents, when marble cities gleamed like jewels along ancient roads, and when the very word Rome meant order, prosperity, and eternal strength. But tonight we'll discover how even the mightiest empires can shatter like pottery dropped on stone. Congratulations, you've just awakened as Marcus Flavius Corvus, a grizzled centurion of the 3rd Augusta Legion, and you find yourself standing on the windswept ramparts of Hadrian's Wall in northern Britannia. The year is 406 AD, and the bitter February wind cuts through your woolen cloak like a blade, carrying with it the scent of snow and something else, something that makes your scarred hands tighten instinctively around your vine staff of office. You've served Rome for 23 years now, your body bearing the proud marks of campaigns from the Germanic forests to the African deserts. Your bronze-plated armor, polished to a dull gleam despite the morning frost, has deflected barbarian spears and absorbed the shock of countless shield walls. The scars on your face and arms tell stories of victories won and brothers lost, each one a chapter in Rome's endless struggle to maintain order along the empire's vast frontiers. Behind you, stretching south like a great stone serpent across the rugged landscape, lies the wall itself, that magnificent barrier built by Emperor Hadrian nearly 3 centuries ago. 84 miles of dressed stone and mortar, studded with 16 major forts and dozens of smaller outposts, manned by auxiliary troops drawn from every corner of the empire. From your vantage point atop the wall, you can see the morning mist rising from the valleys below, where Roman roads arrow straight as spear shafts toward distant Londinium and the civilized world beyond. To the north, however, lies something altogether different. The lands of the Picts and Scots stretch away into a wilderness of moor and mountain, where painted warriors still practice the old ways and Roman law holds no sway. For generations, the wall has held these peoples at bay, a physical manifestation of Rome's determination to draw lines between civilization and barbarism, between order and chaos. But this morning, as you pace the frost-slicked stones and watch your breath form silver clouds in the crisp air, you can sense that something fundamental has changed. The young auxiliary soldier beside you, a nervous Batavian recruit named Gaius Lucilius, shifts restlessly from foot to foot, his eyes constantly scanning the northern horizon. "Centurion," he says quietly, his voice barely audible above the wind. "The scouts haven't returned from their patrol. They were supposed to be back before dawn." You nod grimly, your weathered face betraying none of the concern gnawing at your gut. 3 days now without word from the forward reconnaissance teams. In your experience, when scouts fail to return, it usually means one of two things. They're dead, or they've encountered something so significant they can't risk coming back to report it. Any smoke signals from the watchtowers? You ask, though you already know the answer. You've been checking the signal stations every hour since sunrise, and the stone towers along the wall remain frustratingly silent. Nothing, sir. It's like the whole northern frontier has just gone quiet. That's what worries you most. In your decades of service, you've learned that silence on a frontier is far more ominous than the sounds of battle. Warriors make noise when they're raiding for cattle or testing your defenses. They go silent when they're planning something much larger. You turn your attention southward, toward the interior of the province, and here too there are troubling signs. Smoke rises from the direction of Eboracum, York, but it's the wrong kind of smoke. Not the steady grey columns from cooking fires and workshops, but the thick black billows that speak of major fires, perhaps even burning buildings. Yesterday, a messenger arrived from the provincial capital with disturbing news. Supply convoys from Gaul have stopped arriving. Trade has slowed to a trickle, and there are rumours of massive barbarian movements across the Rhine. Sir Lucilius ventures again. My cousin serves with the 6th Victrix at Eboracum. In his last letter, he mentioned that they're putting civilians to work on the city walls, strengthening the defences. Why would they do that if we're winning the war? You pause in your pacing, studying the young soldier's face. He's maybe 19 years old, recruited from a Batavian family that has served Rome faithfully for generations. His grandfather probably fought alongside your own father during the Marcomannic Wars. His people have been Roman allies for so long that they think in Latin and dream of Roman citizenship for their children. But now you see something in his eyes that chills you more than the February wind. Doubt. For the first time in his young life, this soldier is beginning to question whether Rome truly is eternal, whether the eagles will always fly victorious, whether civilization will always triumph over barbarism. Lucilius, you say finally, placing a calloused hand on his shoulder. In my experience, the best way to survive uncertain times is to focus on what you can control. We control this stretch of the wall. We control the safety of the people in the settlements behind us. We control whether we honor our oaths to Rome and to each other. The young man nods, but you can see he's not entirely convinced. And honestly, you're not sure you are either. A horn blast echoes across the wall. 3 long notes that make your blood run cold. It's the signal from Tower 19, 2 miles to the west. Large force approaching from the north. You grab your bronze war horn and sound the general alarm. The deep notes rolling across the landscape like thunder. As auxiliary soldiers pour from their barracks and man the wall's fighting positions, you climb the ladder to the highest watchtower and peer through the morning haze. There, emerging from the mist like ghosts made flesh, you see them, hundreds of warriors painted in blue woad, their shields glinting in the pale sunlight, moving with a purpose and coordination that speaks of careful planning rather than spontaneous raid. But it's not just their numbers that make your veterans' instincts scream warnings. It's their equipment. These aren't the usual cattle thieves armed with hunting spears and leather shields. You can see Roman armor among them, mail shirts and segmented plates that could only have come from legionary corpses or deserters. Some carry Roman swords, and their shields bear the marks of professional military organization. Gods preserve us, whispers Lucilius, who has climbed up beside you. They look like an army. You lower your bronze viewing tube, your mind already calculating distances, defensive positions, and the grim mathematics of siege warfare. In the growing light, you can make out something else that makes your scarred hands tremble slightly. Smoke rising from the direction of Tower 21, further west along the wall. Either your signal fires are being answered, or that position has already fallen. The world you've known, the world of Roman order and imperial certainty is about to be tested in ways that will determine whether civilization itself can survive what's coming. And you, Marcus Flavius Corvus, veteran of 23 years and keeper of Rome's northern frontier, are about to discover just how quickly everything you've believed in can crumble when the very foundations of empire begin to shake. The barbarians have come not as raiders but as conquerors, and this is only the beginning. As the barbarian warbands advance across the frost-covered moorland toward your section of the wall, you find yourself thinking about how different things were just 5 years ago when you first arrived at this posting. Back then, Britannia felt like the secure northern edge of a stable world, a frontier province that had enjoyed nearly 4 centuries of Roman peace and prosperity. You remember your first inspection tour along the wall with Tribune Cassius Maximilianus, a young patrician from Rome who treated this assignment as an opportunity to add some military experience to his political resume before returning to a comfortable career in the capital. Walking these same ramparts on a warm spring morning, he had gestured expansively toward the south, where neat rectangular fields stretched to the horizon, dotted with Roman villas and connected by perfectly straight roads. "Look at this, centurion," he had said, his voice filled with the casual confidence of someone who had never doubted Rome's permanence. 400 years ago, this was all wilderness, painted savages living in mud huts, worshipping trees and stones. Now look, proper cities, aqueducts, amphitheaters, law courts. We've brought civilization to the very edge of the world, and he was right, at least in those days. Behind the wall lay a thoroughly Romanized landscape where British chieftains' sons learned Latin poetry, where native craftsmen produced goods for export to Gaul and Spain, where former warriors served as auxiliary soldiers and their children grew up dreaming of Roman citizenship. The great fortress city of Eburacum boasted public baths that could accommodate thousands, a stone amphitheater where gladiatorial games drew crowds from across the northern provinces, and a thriving port where ships arrived daily carrying wine from the Mediterranean, olive oil from Spain, and silk from distant Asia. Wealthy Romano-British landowners lived in heated houses decorated with intricate mosaics, their children educated by Greek tutors, their tables laden with imported delicacies. In the market towns, you could buy anything from Germanic amber to African ivory, from British wool to Gallic pottery. But even then, if you knew how to read the signs, there were hints that this prosperity rested on increasingly fragile foundations. The Tribune never seemed to notice how many of the auxiliary cohorts were now filled with Germanic recruits rather than native Britons, or how the great villa estates relied heavily on tenant farmers whose grandparents had been free Celtic farmers before the Roman conquest. He didn't pay attention to the dispatches arriving from Gaul, reporting increasing raids across the Rhine frontier, or the letters from military colleagues describing the growing difficulty of recruiting sufficient troops to maintain full strength in the border legions. You had tried to explain some of these concerns to him during one of his inspection tours, standing in the Principia, the headquarters building of the fortress at Birdoswald, surrounded by maps showing the disposition of troops across the northern frontier. You had pointed out how thinly stretched your forces really were. "Sir," you had said, choosing your words carefully, 20 years ago each major fort along the wall maintained a full auxiliary cohort, that's 500 men. Now we're lucky if we can field 300 per fort, and half of those are recent recruits who barely speak Latin and have never faced serious combat. The Tribune had waved away your concerns with the casual gesture of someone accustomed to having problems solved by others. The barbarians beyond the wall are a nuisance, not a real threat, centurion. They lack organization, proper equipment, and the discipline for sustained warfare. A few punitive expeditions should keep them in line. What he failed to understand was that the barbarians beyond the wall had been learning from their contacts with Rome for generations. The Pictish and Scottish chieftains who now threatened the northern frontier were not the same disorganized tribal raiders that Hadrian's legions had faced centuries earlier. They had observed Roman military tactics, acquired Roman weapons through trade and battlefield salvage, and most importantly, they had begun to unite under leaders who understood that Rome's apparent strength often masked real weaknesses. Your own experience had taught you this lesson during the Caledonia campaign 3 years earlier. What was supposed to be a straightforward raid to recover stolen cattle had turned into a near disaster when your column was ambushed by Pictish warriors who used Roman-style cavalry tactics and carried arms and armor that clearly came from imperial armories. They fought like legionaries, you had reported to your commanding officer, after struggling back to the wall with half your century dead or wounded. Disciplined formations, coordinated attacks, and they knew exactly how to exploit the terrain to neutralize our advantages. But perhaps most troubling of all had been the discovery, among the enemy dead, of several men who were clearly not native Caledonians. Their equipment was Roman military issue. Their weapons showed the wear patterns of professional soldiers, and one corpse bore tattoos marking him as a veteran of the Rhine legions. Deserters perhaps, or prisoners of war who had thrown in their lot with Rome's enemies. Either way, it meant that your opponents now had access to detailed knowledge of Roman military organization, tactics, and weaknesses. Standing on the wall this morning, watching the approaching warbands, you can see evidence that this process of military evolution has accelerated dramatically. The warriors advancing across the moor move in organized formations, their shields locked together in something resembling a Roman testudo formation. Their flankers maintain proper intervals and seem to be following complex tactical signals, rather than simply charging forward in the wild rush that characterized earlier barbarian attacks. More ominously, you can make out what appears to be siege equipment among their ranks, wheeled catapults and scaling ladders that suggest they're prepared for sustained assault rather than hit-and-run raiding. Someone has been teaching these people the finer points of Roman siege warfare, and teaching them well. Young Lucilius, still standing beside you in the watchtower, points toward a group of horsemen riding behind the main body of infantry. Centurion, those riders, their armor looks like auxiliary cavalry gear. You finish grimly. Mail shirts, spatha swords and oval shields. Either they've been trading with Roman suppliers, or you leave the alternative unspoken, but both of you understand its implications. The comfortable world of Roman Britannia, with its peaceful villas and thriving market towns, its assumption of imperial invincibility and barbarian inferiority, is about to collide with a harsh new reality. The empire that once seemed eternal and unshakable has begun to show cracks in its foundation, and those cracks are widening with each passing month. And you, Marcus Flavius Corvus, are standing at the precise point where these two worlds are about to meet in violence. The first real sign that something had fundamentally shifted in the order of the world came 6 months ago, during what should have been a routine supply delivery from Gaul. You were conducting morning weapons inspection with your sentry when a lone horseman approached the wall's southern gate, his mount foam-flecked and trembling from a hard ride. The man himself looked like he'd ridden through the underworld, his cloak torn, his face gaunt with exhaustion and something deeper, fear. Message for the commanding officer, he had gasped, sliding from his saddle and nearly collapsing. From Governor Quintus Valerius in Londinium, priority dispatch. You had escorted him to Tribune Maximilianus, who broke the seal with his usual casual confidence. But as he read the wax tablet, you watched his face change color. the blood draining from his cheeks until he looked like a man who had just received news of his own death. "Centurion," he said quietly, his voice stripped of its usual authority, "assemble the senior officers, immediately." The news the messenger brought was almost incomprehensible in its scope. On the last day of December, just 2 months earlier, a massive confederation of Germanic tribes, Vandals, Alans, and Suebi, had crossed the frozen Rhine River in overwhelming numbers. Not a raid, not a minor incursion, but an invasion involving tens of thousands of warriors, their families, their livestock, their entire way of life. They had swept through Gaul like a plague of locusts, overwhelming Roman defences that had held secure for centuries. The cities of Mogontiacum and Argentoratum have fallen. The tribune read from the dispatch, his voice hollow. Colonia Agrippina is under siege. The Rhine frontier has effectively ceased to exist as a defensive barrier. But it was the messenger's personal testimony that truly revealed the magnitude of what was happening. During the brief rest you gave him before he continued south with additional dispatches, he sat in your quarters sharing a cup of watered wine and speaking in the halting voice of a man still processing trauma. "I was stationed at Duro Cortorum when the first refugees arrived," he told you, staring into his cup as if it might contain answers to impossible questions. "Centurion, I've served on the Germanic frontier for 15 years. I've seen tribal raids, seasonal campaigns, the usual border troubles. This was different. These weren't warriors looking for plunder and glory. They were entire peoples on the move. Men, women, children, elders, wagons loaded with everything they owned." He took a shaky sip of wine before continuing. "The refugees told us stories that seemed impossible. Whole Roman settlements abandoned without a fight. Legionary commanders negotiating with barbarian kings instead of fighting them. Citizens fleeing south with nothing but the clothes on their backs, leaving behind generations of accumulated wealth." "What about the legions?" you had asked. "Surely the Rhine army responded." The messenger's laugh was bitter. "What Rhine army? Half the frontier forces have been withdrawn to deal with usurpers in Hispania and Africa. The remaining units are spread so thin they can barely garrison their fortresses, let alone conduct mobile operations against enemy forces that outnumber them 10 to 1. This was when you began to understand that the crisis wasn't just military, it was systemic. The empire's problems had become interconnected in ways that made traditional solutions impossible. Political instability in the form of rival claimants to imperial power meant that military resources were constantly being diverted from frontier defense to civil wars. Economic pressures made it increasingly difficult to maintain the massive armies needed to defend such extensive borders, and the barbarian peoples pressing against those borders had themselves evolved, becoming more organized, more numerous, and more desperate. Over the following months, as sporadic news filtered north to Hadrian's wall, you began to piece together a picture of accelerating collapse. The barbarian invasion of Gaul hadn't been contained or reversed. It had triggered a cascade of additional migrations and invasions as displaced populations sought new homes and opportunities. Roman authority in large parts of Gaul had simply evaporated, not through dramatic military defeats but through a kind of administrative paralysis, as local commanders found themselves unable to cope with problems that exceeded all previous experience. The economic implications reached Britannia within weeks. Ships that normally brought wine, olive oil, and manufactured goods from the continent simply stopped arriving. The few vessels that did make the crossing brought refugees rather than cargo. Roman officials, wealthy merchants, and military officers who had abandoned their posts in Gaul rather than face the chaos consuming their provinces. You remember one particular conversation with a former garrison commander from Geseraicum, a grizzled veteran named Lucius Aemilius, who had served with distinction on multiple frontiers before finding himself overwhelmed by circumstances beyond any individual's control. The barbarians weren't the worst part, he told you during a quiet evening in the officers' mess. It was watching Roman civilization just dissolve. Cities that had been prosperous for centuries turned into empty shells within months. Not because they were destroyed, but because they were abandoned. Citizens fled, administrators disappeared, trade stopped. The physical infrastructure remained intact, but the social systems that made it meaningful simply collapsed. He paused, staring into the fire that crackled in the central hearth. I held my position for 3 months after the initial invasion, maintaining a garrison in a city where no one came to the markets, where the aqueducts still flowed but no one collected the water, where the amphitheatre stood empty and weeds grew through the paving stones in the forum. In the end, what's the point of defending a place that no longer exists as a living community? These conversations began to change your understanding of what you were really defending along Hadrian's wall. It wasn't just a political border or a military frontier. It was the northern edge of a civilization that was increasingly fragile, increasingly dependent on systems and assumptions that were proving less reliable than anyone had imagined. The barbarian warbands now approaching your section of the wall weren't just raiders seeking plunder. They were representatives of a new reality, one in which Roman military superiority could no longer be taken for granted, in which the economic and political systems that supported the empire's vast defensive infrastructure were buckling under pressures that exceeded their design limits. As you watched their organized advance across the moorland, you realize that everything you've believed about Rome's permanence, about the civilized world's inherent advantages over barbarism, is about to be tested in the most direct possible way. And from what you've learned about the situation in Gaul, you have serious doubts about whether the test can be passed. The deteriorating situation became impossible to ignore when the food began running out. It started subtly. Rations reduced by a quarter, then by half, then supplemented with coarse barley normally reserved for horses. By early spring, you found yourself doing something that would have been unthinkable just a year earlier, personally leading foraging parties into the countryside behind the wall, searching for whatever provisions could be found or requisitioned from increasingly reluctant local farmers. It was during one of these expeditions, 3 weeks before the current barbarian assault, that you encountered Gaius Britannicus, a Romano-British landowner whose villa estate had been one of the most prosperous in the region. You found him standing in what had once been his flourishing wheat fields, now trampled and muddy, staring at the smoking ruins of his grain storage buildings. "Centurion," he said without turning around, his voice carrying the hollow tone of a man who had watched his world systematically destroyed, "I suppose you've come for the tribute grain. I'm afraid there isn't any." You dismounted from your horse and walked to stand beside him, noting the exhaustion etched into his face, the way his expensive toga hung loose on a frame that had clearly lost considerable weight. This was a man who 6 months ago had entertained provincial officials in his heated dining rooms, whose tables groaned under the weight of imported delicacies, whose children wore silk and received private tutoring in Greek philosophy. What happened here? You asked. Though the evidence was clear enough, the villa's outer buildings showed signs of organized destruction, not the random violence of a raiding party, but the systematic dismantling carried out by people who knew exactly what they were looking for. "My own tenant farmers," Britannicus replied bitterly. "3 generations of families who worked this land under my father and grandfather. Last month, when I couldn't pay their wages because the grain merchants in Eboracum had stopped honoring their contracts, they simply took what they considered theirs, not just the stored grain, but the livestock, the farm equipment, even the bronze fittings from the villa's plumbing. He gestured toward a group of crude shelters that had been erected near the ruins of his slave quarters. They're still here, living on my land, but they no longer acknowledge my authority. They formed some sort of council, elected their own leaders, and they claim they're operating under traditional British laws rather than Roman property statutes. This was happening throughout the province. You had learned from similar encounters. The economic disruption caused by the collapse of trade with Gaul had created a cascade of failures that reached every level of Romano-British society. Merchants couldn't pay for goods, landowners couldn't pay workers, workers couldn't buy food, soldiers couldn't receive regular supplies. The complex web of financial relationships that held Roman civilization together was unraveling thread by thread. Your own soldiers were feeling the pressure in ways that threatened military discipline itself. During the previous week's pay parade, you had been forced to deliver news that would have sparked mutiny in previous generations. The bronze coins arriving from the provincial treasury were increasingly debased with lead and tin, making them virtually worthless for purchasing goods from civilian traders. Some of your auxiliaries were now supplementing their rations by hunting in the forests behind the wall, a practice that technically violated military regulations but had become essential for basic survival. The situation was made worse by refugees streaming north from the areas of Gaul now under barbarian control. These weren't just displaced peasants seeking temporary shelter. They included Roman officials, military officers, wealthy merchants, and skilled craftsmen, all of whom had abandoned their previous lives and now competed with the local population for increasingly scarce resources. You remembered the arrival of Prefect Marcus Claudius Severus, formerly commander of auxiliary forces along the Rhine frontier, who had appeared at the wall's gates with a small retinue of loyal soldiers and a wagon train loaded with whatever valuables they had managed to salvage from their retreat. Centurion, he had told you during a private conference in your quarters, I need you to understand what we're facing. This isn't a temporary crisis that will resolve itself once imperial forces re-establish control. I've seen entire provinces simply cease to function as Roman territories, not conquered by barbarian armies, but abandoned by Roman administration because the cost of maintaining control exceeded the resources available. Severus had served along the Rhine for 12 years before the Great Invasion, and his testimony provided crucial insights into how quickly Roman authority could dissolve when faced with pressures it wasn't designed to handle. The barbarians didn't defeat us in pitched battle, he explained. They simply ignored our traditional defensive strategies and created problems we couldn't solve with military force alone. When 100,000 people cross your frontier, not as an invading army but as migrating families looking for new homes, how do you respond? Do you massacre children and elderly civilians? Do you try to negotiate resettlement terms? Do you simply retreat and hope they move on? The prefect's questions highlighted a fundamental weakness in Roman strategic thinking. The empire's military and administrative systems had evolved to deal with clearly defined enemies operating according to recognizable patterns of behavior. But the current crisis involved peoples who weren't following the established rules of war and diplomacy, who weren't seeking the traditional goals of tribal raiding or territorial conquest. They want to become Romans, Severus had said with bitter irony. Not citizens of the empire, but inhabitants of Roman lands, users of Roman infrastructure, beneficiaries of Roman agricultural techniques and urban organization. They're not trying to destroy our civilization. They're trying to take it over and run it themselves. This created dilemmas that traditional Roman responses couldn't address. Military force alone couldn't solve problems rooted in economic disruption, demographic pressure, and the breakdown of administrative systems. Diplomatic negotiations were meaningless when dealing with peoples who had no intention of returning to their previous territories and no centralized authority capable of enforcing agreements. As you stand on the wall now, watching the approaching barbarian force, you realize that this represents the culmination of months of escalating pressures that have systematically weakened every aspect of Roman defensive capability. Your soldiers are undernourished and demoralized. Your supply lines have been disrupted. The civilian population behind you is increasingly hostile to military requisitions that compete with their own survival needs. Most critically, the very foundations of Roman authority, the assumption that imperial power represents order, prosperity, and security, have been fatally undermined by events that no individual commander, no matter how skilled or dedicated, could have prevented or controlled. The barbarians advancing across the moor aren't just threatening to breach a physical barrier. They're the visible manifestation of forces that have already breached the far more important barriers of economic stability, political legitimacy, and social cohesion that actually held the Roman world together. The barbarian assault begins at dawn with a sound you've never heard in 23 years of military service, the coordinated war cries of thousands of warriors striking in perfect unison, their voices echoing off the stone walls like thunder rolling across the moors. But it's not the noise that makes your veteran instincts scream warnings. It's the disciplined silence that follows, broken only by the measured rhythm of feet moving in formation, and the metallic scraping of weapons being readied for combat. "Sweet Jupiter," whispers Lucilius beside you, his knuckles white where they grip his javelin. "They're using our own signals." He's right. The horn calls directing the barbarian advance are unmistakably Roman, the same notes you've heard countless times during training exercises and military maneuvers. Someone among their ranks not only understands imperial tactical doctrine but has been teaching it to warriors who should never have learned such sophisticated coordination. The initial attack comes against the eastern gate of your section, where the wall curves slightly to follow the natural contours of the ridge. But instead of the wild charge you expected, the barbarians advance methodically, their shields locked together in overlapping formations that would make any drill instructor proud. Behind the infantry, you can see teams of warriors wheeling forward what appears to be a battering ram constructed from oak timbers and reinforced with iron bands, engineering that speaks of Roman siege warfare knowledge. All units to defensive positions. You bellow, your voice carrying across the ramparts despite the din of battle. Archers to the towers. Scorpion crews target their siege engines. Your soldiers respond with the automatic precision of professional troops, but you can sense their unease. These aren't the disorganized tribal raiders they've trained to repel. The barbarians below move with purpose and intelligence, adapting their tactics in real time as your defensive measures take effect. When your archers loose their first volley, the attackers don't break and scatter as barbarians traditionally do. Instead, they raise their shields in a coordinated umbrella formation, a testudo that protects them from missile fire while maintaining their advance. Worse, some of their own archers begin returning fire with composite bows that have greater range and penetrating power than your standard military equipment. The siege ram reaches the gate faster than you anticipated, its crew protected by a wheeled shed that deflects your scorpion bolts and archer fire. The rhythmic pounding that follows each impact sends vibrations through the stone beneath your feet, and you realize with growing alarm that the gate's iron reinforcements, old even when you first arrived at this posting, are beginning to show stress fractures. Centurion calls Optio Gaius Marcellus from the eastern tower. Movement on the flanks. They're sending climbing parties up the wall face. You rush to the parapet and peer over the edge, your heart sinking at what you see. Groups of barbarian warriors are scaling the wall using rope ladders and iron hooks, their assault coordinated with the main attack to divide your defensive attention. These aren't improvised tools. Someone has manufactured proper siege equipment specifically designed to overcome Roman fortifications. But the most chilling moment comes when you hear a voice calling up from below in perfect military Latin. "Romans, your position is hopeless. Surrender now and you'll be allowed to depart with your personal weapons and equipment." You lean forward to get a better look at the speaker and feel your blood turn to ice. Standing among the barbarian warriors, clearly directing their assault, is a man wearing the bronze-scaled armor of a Roman centurion. His vine staff of office, the symbol of military authority you carry yourself, gleams in the morning sunlight as he gestures toward different sections of the wall, pointing out tactical vulnerabilities with the expertise of someone who has studied Roman defensive doctrine from the inside. "Do you know him?" asks Lucilius, who has followed you to the parapet. You study the man's face, scarred and weathered like your own, trying to place him among the hundreds of officers you've served alongside during your career. There's something familiar about his bearing, the way he carries himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to command. Then it hits you. This is Quintus Fabius Maximus, a centurion who served with the Second Augusta Legion until he disappeared during a patrol action beyond the wall 6 months ago. His unit reported him killed in action, but clearly he's very much alive and now fighting for the enemy. The implications are staggering. This isn't just a deserter who's thrown in his lot with barbarian raiders. This is a Roman officer who has actively chosen to share military expertise with peoples he once fought against, teaching them how to overcome defenses he once helped design. The knowledge he possesses, fortress layouts, supply procedures, communication protocols, tactical doctrine, could make barbarian forces exponentially more effective against Roman positions throughout the frontier. "Fabius," you call down, your voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "What in the name of the gods are you doing?" The renegade centurion looks up, his eyes meeting yours across the span of stone and ideology that now separates you. When he responds, his voice carries the bitter tone of a man who has made peace with choices that would have been unthinkable in a different world. "Surviving Corvus," he shouts back. "Same as you should be doing. Rome is finished in the north. These people offered me a place in the world that's coming. A world where competence matters more than bloodlines, where loyalty is earned rather than demanded." His words hit you like a physical blow because they echo doubts you've been harboring but haven't dared voice. The systematic breakdown of imperial authority, the failure of supply systems, the abandonment of defensive positions throughout Gaul, all of it points toward the collapse of Roman power in the western provinces. The gate beneath you gives an ominous groan as the battering ram strikes again, and you realize that this assault represents more than just another barbarian raid. It's a test of whether Roman military traditions, Roman courage, and Roman determination can overcome the advantages that come from superior numbers, better intelligence, and the desperate motivation of peoples who have nowhere else to go. The battle for Hadrian's wall has begun, and with it the final test of whether the northern frontier of Roman Britannia can survive the forces that have already overwhelmed the empire's continental defenses. The eastern gate holds for 3 hours before the ancient iron bands finally snap under the relentless pounding of the barbarian ram. As the massive oak doors splinter inward, you make a decision that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. You order your men to abandon the outer defenses and fall back to the second defensive line within the fort itself. Withdrawal by sections, you bellow over the sounds of splintering wood and barbarian war cries. 3rd and 4th centuries hold the ramparts, while 1st and 2nd fall back to the Principia. Move with purpose, not panic. Your soldiers respond with the disciplined precision that marks the difference between a trained legion and a barbarian warband, but you can see the doubt in their eyes. Roman doctrine has always emphasized holding fixed positions, never yielding ground to the enemy. The very concept of strategic withdrawal runs counter to everything they've been taught about military honor and imperial invincibility. As your men execute the fighting retreat, you find yourself adapting tactics you never learned in any military manual. The barbarians pouring through the breached gate encounter not the panicked rout they expected, but a carefully orchestrated defense in depth that turns the fort's own architecture against them. Your archers, positioned in the administrative buildings around the central courtyard, can fire down on attackers channeled into narrow passages between structures. Lucilius you call to the young Batavian, who has proven surprisingly steady under fire. Take 10 men and barricade the armory. If they capture our weapons stores, this fight is over. But even as you coordinate these defensive measures, you're learning disturbing lessons about your enemies. The barbarians aren't simply rushing forward in the blood-mad frenzy that Roman writers love to describe. They're probing for weaknesses, testing your responses, adapting their own tactics based on what they observe. When your archers prove effective from the rooftops, barbarian shields teams move to provide cover for their own missile troops. When you concentrate defenders at obvious choke points, they find alternative routes through gaps in the fort's construction that only someone with detailed architectural knowledge could have identified. The renegade centurion Fabius appears at the head of a group of warriors moving with unmistakably Roman tactical coordination. They advance in a wedge formation, shields locked together, spears projecting forward in a bristling hedge of iron points. It's a textbook manipular assault, executed with precision that would earn commendation marks during peacetime exercises. Romans. Fabius calls out as his formation approaches the Principia steps. You're fighting for a dead empire. Join us and help build something new from its ashes. Some of your men actually hesitate, and you realize that the barbarian leader's words are having an effect that traditional enemy threats never could. He's not offering them death or slavery. He's offering them a future, a place in a world where their military skills would remain valuable even after imperial authority has collapsed. During a brief lull in the fighting, as both sides catch their breath and tend their wounded, you overhear a conversation between two of your auxiliaries that crystallizes your growing understanding of how profoundly the situation has changed. My cousin serves with the garrison at Eboracum, one soldier tells another as they share water from a cracked amphora. His last letter said they haven't received full pay in 4 months. The locals won't accept our coins anymore. They want payment in grain or manufactured goods. At least your cousin still has a garrison to serve with, his companion replies bitterly. My brother was stationed at Diva. Last month the entire legion just disbanded. The legate told them they were free to seek employment elsewhere because the provincial government couldn't maintain them anymore. These aren't isolated incidents, you realize. Across the northern frontier, Roman military units are facing the same impossible choice between maintaining obsolete loyalties to an empire that can no longer support them, or adapting to new realities that might offer better chances of survival. The renewed barbarian assault comes with a tactical innovation that demonstrates how quickly they're learning from each engagement. Instead of concentrating their force against your strongest defensive positions, they launch simultaneous probing attacks at multiple points, forcing you to divide your already outnumbered defenders. When you reinforce one threatened section, they immediately shift their main effort to another area that's been left temporarily vulnerable. But perhaps most unsettling is the way they've begun incorporating captured Roman equipment and techniques into their own operations. You watch in fascination and horror as barbarian warriors use a captured scorpion ballista, operated by someone who clearly understands its mechanisms to provide covering fire for their assault teams. The precision of their shots suggests not just familiarity with the weapon but formal training in its use. As the afternoon wears on and your defensive perimeter continues to contract, you begin to implement survival strategies that have more in common with guerrilla warfare than traditional Roman military doctrine. Your men dig improvised foxholes in the fort's courtyard, creating overlapping fields of fire that turn the open space into a killing ground. They sabotage their own equipment rather than allow it to fall into enemy hands, destroying supplies and weapons that took years to accumulate. Most significantly, you find yourself thinking less like a Roman centurion defending imperial territory and more like a tribal war chief protecting his band of followers. The abstract concepts of duty to Rome and service to the emperor become secondary to the immediate practical concerns of keeping your men alive and maintaining their morale in the face of overwhelming odds. When young Lucilius approaches you during another brief respite, his question cuts straight to the heart of your evolving understanding. Centurion, if we survive this, what then? Where do we go? What do we fight for? You look around at the smoke-stained ruins of what was once a symbol of Roman power and permanence, at your exhausted soldiers who have proven their courage but can't change the larger forces destroying their world, and realize that you don't have any good answers to give him. The old certainties are gone, and you're all going to have to learn new ways of surviving in whatever comes next. By sunset, your small force has lost the fort entirely. The Principia burns behind you as you lead the surviving members of your century, barely 30 men out of the 80 who began the day, through a sally port that opens onto the southern face of the wall. The evacuation is a calculated retreat rather than a panicked rout, but the symbolism is unmistakable. For the first time since Emperor Hadrian ordered its construction, a section of the Great Wall has fallen to barbarian assault. As you guide your men through the darkness toward the secondary defensive positions 3 miles south, you encounter other groups of survivors from the neighboring forts. The stories they tell paint a picture of coordinated barbarian success that extends far beyond your own section of the frontier. Tower 17 fell at midday, reports Centurion Gaius Valerius, whose weathered face shows the strain of leading his own fighting withdrawal. The bastards used fire arrows to ignite the thatched roof of the barracks, then stormed the position while my men were fighting the flames. I lost half my century getting the survivors out. Another officer, Prefect Marcus Antonius from the auxiliary cavalry stationed at Burduswald, brings even more disturbing news. The barbarians aren't just breaking through isolated positions, they're maintaining communication between their assault groups. I saw signal fires coordinating attacks across a 20-mile front. Someone's taught them operational level warfare. This revelation transforms your understanding of what you're facing. Individual barbarian raids, even large ones, could be contained and eventually repelled using traditional defensive strategies. But a coordinated offensive that can simultaneously strike multiple positions while maintaining tactical unity represents a qualitatively different threat, one that requires responses beyond the capabilities of scattered frontier garrisons. As your combined force takes shelter in a fortified villa that dominates a strategic crossroads, you begin to grasp the wider implications of the day's events. The villa belongs to Senator Lucius Flavius Agricola, a wealthy Romano-British landowner whose estate has prospered under imperial protection for 3 generations. But when you arrive seeking temporary refuge, you find him in the midst of organizing his own evacuation. Enthusiasm. He greets you with barely concealed desperation. "Thank the gods you're here. Perhaps you can provide escort from my household as we withdraw south to Londinium. The senator's request highlights a crucial aspect of the crisis that extends far beyond military concerns. The barbarian breakthrough hasn't just breached a defensive line, it has shattered the psychological foundations upon which Romano-British civilization rests. If wealthy landowners like Agricola are abandoning estates that have been in their families for generations, it means the social and economic structures supporting Roman authority are collapsing as quickly as the military ones. Senator, you reply carefully, I'm not sure Londinium will be much safer. The reports we've received suggest the barbarian penetration extends across the entire northern frontier. Even if you reach the capital, you may find it overwhelmed with refugees and unable to provide the security you're seeking. Agricola's response reveals how quickly the comfortable assumptions of Roman life are disintegrating. Then where can we go? My family has served Rome faithfully for 3 generations. My grandfather received his citizenship from Emperor Trajan himself. We've paid our taxes, maintained our villa, provided grain for the imperial army. Surely the empire won't simply abandon us. But even as he speaks these words, you can see in his eyes the growing realization that imperial protection may no longer be available to anyone, regardless of their loyalty or social status. The villa around you, with its heated floors and painted walls depicting classical scenes, represents an investment in permanence and stability that suddenly seems naively optimistic. Over the next several hours, as your men rest and tend their wounds, you witness a microcosm of the broader transformation sweeping across the northern provinces. Agricola's household slaves, Britons whose grandparents had been conquered by Roman legions but who had prospered under imperial rule, begin making their own calculations about the changing situation. Master, you overhear one of the senior household servants telling Agricola during a hushed conversation in the villa's atrium, the field workers are saying they won't come south with us. They want to stay and negotiate with whoever ends up controlling this territory. This represents more than simple abandonment by disloyal servants. It reflects a pragmatic assessment by people who understand that their survival depends on adapting to new realities rather than clinging to old loyalties. If Roman authority can no longer protect its supporters, then those supporters must find new sources of security and prosperity. The villa's overseer, a freedman named Gaius Britannicus who has managed the estate's agricultural operations for 15 years, approaches you with a proposal that crystallizes the dilemmas facing everyone caught in this transition. Centurion, he says quietly, I've been thinking about our situation. The barbarians who've broken through the wall, they're not just raiders looking for plunder. They're settlers seeking new homes, and they'll need people who know how to work this land, how to maintain the infrastructure, how to organize agricultural production. He pauses, choosing his words carefully. If some of us were to remain behind and offer our services to the new authorities, we might be able to preserve something of what we've built here. The villa could continue functioning, the fields could still be worked, the local population could avoid the disruption of total war. His suggestion represents a form of collaboration that would have been unthinkable just days earlier, but which now seems like a rational response to impossible circumstances. Rather than fleeing south as refugees, abandoning everything they've worked to create, some Romano-British communities are beginning to consider accommodation with the barbarian forces as a path toward maintaining their way of life under new management. This pattern, you realize, is probably being repeated throughout the affected territories. Roman civilization isn't simply being destroyed by barbarian conquest, it's being absorbed, adapted and transformed by peoples who want to benefit from its achievements rather than eliminate them entirely. As dawn approaches and you prepare to continue the withdrawal south, you receive a message from a Roman cavalry patrol that provides the final piece of evidence for how completely the situation has changed. The barbarian forces that breached the wall haven't stopped to consolidate their gains or establish permanent defensive positions. Instead, they're continuing their advance south, moving in coordinated columns toward the major population centers of the province. They're not acting like raiders, the cavalry messenger reports. They're moving like an army of occupation, taking control of strategic points, establishing supply lines, setting up what looks like a permanent administrative structure. The fall of Hadrian's wall, you now understand, wasn't an end but a beginning, the first stage of a transformation that will ultimately reshape the entire character of Roman Britannia. The question is no longer whether imperial authority can be restored, but rather what will emerge from the ruins of the old order. And you, Marcus Flavius Corvus, veteran of a dying empire, must decide whether to continue fighting for a cause that may no longer exist, or find your own path through the chaos of a world being reborn. 3 days into your southward retreat, you encounter something that makes the barbarian breakthrough seem almost manageable by comparison: complete social collapse in what should have been the most secure and prosperous regions of the province. The market town of Corinium, which you remember as a thriving commercial center during your last visit 2 years ago, has transformed into something resembling a battlefield. As you crest the hill overlooking the settlement, you're greeted by the sight of smoke rising from half a dozen buildings, while armed groups patrol the streets in formations that suggest organized conflict rather than random violence. But these aren't barbarian war bands. The men below wear Roman armor and carry imperial weapons, their movements coordinated by horn signals you recognize from standard military procedure. Centurion, whispers Optio Marcellus, who has climbed up beside you for a better view. Those are legionary standards down there. But I count at least 3 different units, and they're facing off against each other. You focus your attention on the central forum, where you can make out the distinctive scarlet cloaks of centurions commanding what appears to be a standoff between rival military formations. This isn't barbarian invasion, it's civil war among Roman forces, the kind of internal conflict that has historically proven far more destructive to imperial authority than any external threat. Your worst fears are confirmed when a mounted patrol approaches your position from the direction of the town. The riders wear the equipment of auxiliary cavalry, but their leader identifies himself in a way that immediately clarifies the dangerous complexity of the situation you've stumbled into. I am Decurion Gaius Flavius Maximus, serving under the authority of Emperor Marcus Gratianus. He announces with the formal precision of an official proclamation. State your unit designation and your allegiance. The problem, of course, is that you've never heard of any Emperor Marcus Gratianus. During your years of frontier service, you've grown accustomed to occasional news of usurpers and rival claimants to imperial power, but such conflicts have traditionally been distant affairs that rarely affected day-to-day military operations. Now it appears that the collapse of central authority has created a situation where multiple individuals are claiming imperial legitimacy, each demanding the loyalty of whatever military forces they can attract. I serve Rome, you reply carefully, under the authority of Emperor Honorius, as confirmed by my commission from the provincial governor in Londinium. The decurion's expression shifts to something between amusement and pity. Honorius, friend. Honorius was deposed 6 months ago by the Senate in favor of Constantine III, who was himself overthrown by Gratianus just last month. Your information is badly out of date. This revelation hits you like a physical blow. The political chaos you've heard rumors about has apparently reached the point where imperial authority itself has become meaningless. not because it's been conquered by external enemies, but because it's been fragmented among competing Roman factions, each claiming legitimacy while undermining the others. What's the situation in Corinium, you ask, though you already suspect the answer. Civil war, the decurion replies bluntly. The Second Augusta Legion garrison declared for Gratianus, but a cohort of the 20th Valeria arrived 3 days ago claiming to represent Constantine, who they say is still the rightful emperor. Meanwhile, the local municipal authorities are trying to remain neutral while protecting what's left of the civilian population. As he speaks, you can hear the distant sounds of fighting from the direction of the town, not the wild cries of barbarian assault, but the disciplined shouts of Roman soldiers using familiar tactics against other Roman soldiers. The irony is bitter. While barbarian forces advance unopposed through a breached frontier, imperial troops are destroying each other in conflicts over titles and claims that may be irrelevant to the survival of Roman civilization itself. The decurion continues his explanation with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who has grown accustomed to impossible situations. Emperor Gratianus has established his capital at Arelate in southern Gaul, where he controls the remaining Mediterranean territories. His representatives arrived last month demanding that all military units in Britannia acknowledge his authority and prepare to evacuate the island for redeployment to more defensible positions. Evacuate the island? The implications are staggering. You're being told that imperial policy now involves abandoning an entire province that has been Roman for nearly 4 centuries, writing off the investments, infrastructure, and populations that represent generations of civilizing effort. The barbarian penetration of Gaul has made the northern provinces untenable, the decurion explains. Better to consolidate remaining forces in territories that can actually be defended than to waste them trying to hold positions that are strategically hopeless. This represents a complete reversal of traditional Roman strategic thinking, which has always emphasized the expansion and defense of territorial holdings regardless of cost. The willingness to simply abandon entire provinces suggests that the imperial government, whatever faction currently claims that authority, has accepted that the empire's resources are no longer sufficient to maintain its historical extent. But the situation becomes even more complex when you encounter the rival Roman forces later that afternoon. Centurion Lucius Valerius Maximus, commanding the 20th Valeria detachment, presents an entirely different version of current political reality. Gratianus is a usurper supported by barbarian mercenaries. He tells you with the conviction of someone whose career depends on being correct. Constantine III remains the legitimate emperor, recognized by the Senate and supported by the majority of provincial governors. We're here to prevent the evacuation of loyal Roman citizens and to maintain imperial authority until reinforcements arrive from Gaul. The competing narratives reveal how completely the crisis has undermined not just military organization but the basic concepts of authority and legitimacy that hold any government together. When different Roman commanders receive contradictory orders from officials who all claim imperial authority, when established procedures for determining legal succession have broken down, when military units must choose between competing loyalties without clear guidance about which choice serves Rome's true interests, the practical result is the dissolution of coordinated resistance to external threats. As evening falls and you make camp between the warring factions, trying to avoid involvement in conflicts that seem to have no clear resolution, you receive a visit from an unexpected source, Quintus Fabius Maximus, the renegade centurion who led the barbarian assault on your section of the wall just days earlier. He approaches your campfire under a flag of truce, accompanied by a small escort of barbarian warriors who wait respectfully at a distance while he speaks. Corvus, he says, settling beside your fire with the easy familiarity of old comrades. I've been watching the situation down here with great interest. Tell me, which emperor are you fighting for today? Which faction of Romans are you prepared to kill in defense of imperial unity? His questions cut straight to the heart of your growing disillusionment. The barbarian breakthrough of the wall, devastating as it was, represented a comprehensible military challenge. But this chaos of competing authorities, contradictory orders, and Roman forces destroying each other while external enemies advance unopposed. This represents something far more threatening to your sense of purpose and identity. What do you want, Fabius? You ask wearily. To offer you the same choice I made, he replies. Stop fighting for an empire that no longer exists, and start building something new from its ruins. The decisive moment comes not in the grand clash of armies you might have expected, but in the muddy fields outside Corinium, where hunger has become a more immediate enemy than any barbarian warband or rival Roman faction. For 3 days you've watched the various military units, yours the 2nd Augusta Loyalists, the 20th Valeria Detachment, and even some of Fabius's barbarian allies gradually stop fighting each other as a more pressing crisis emerges, the complete breakdown of food distribution systems. The town's granaries, which should have contained enough stored grain to feed the population through the spring planting season, stand empty, not looted by raiders or destroyed in combat, but systematically emptied by competing authorities, each claiming the right to requisition supplies for their respective causes. The result is that thousands of people, soldiers and civilians alike, now face starvation in the midst of what should be abundant agricultural territory. It's young Lucilius who brings you the proposal that will define everything that follows. He approaches your position near the abandoned market square, accompanied by 2 other soldiers you don't initially recognize, a weather-beaten auxiliary from the 2nd Augusta, and a tall Germanic warrior who wears Roman mail, but carries weapons of obvious barbarian manufacture. Centurion, Lucilius begins hesitantly. We've been talking with some of the other men, Romans and others, about the food situation. The barbarian warrior steps forward and speaks in accented but clear Latin. I am Wulfric, war leader under Fabius. My people have grain stored in the hill settlements north of here, enough to feed all the hungry men in this valley, Roman and barbarian alike. The auxiliary from the 2nd Augusta nods grimly. Sir, my unit hasn't received rations in 4 days. The centurions keep saying supplies are coming from the south, but nothing arrives. My men are starting to talk about alternatives. You understand immediately what he means. Soldiers facing starvation don't maintain discipline indefinitely. If they can't obtain food through official channels, they'll eventually take it by force from civilian populations, transforming the Roman army from protector to predator of the very people it's supposed to defend. What exactly are you proposing? You ask, though you suspect you already know the answer. Wulfric gestures toward the hills where barbarian cooking fires are visible among the trees. Joint foraging expedition. Romans and my people working together to gather provisions from the abandoned farms in the northern districts. Equal shares for all participants regardless of which side they fought for yesterday. The proposal represents a complete abandonment of traditional military protocol. Roman soldiers cooperating with barbarian warriors, sharing resources with people they were trying to kill just days earlier, acknowledging that survival might require setting aside loyalties that no longer serve practical purposes. But as you look around the devastated market square, where civilians huddle around small fires burning furniture scavenged from abandoned buildings, where Roman soldiers eye the dwindling supplies with growing desperation, you realize that traditional protocol has already failed. The question isn't whether to maintain military discipline, but whether any of you will live long enough for discipline to matter. The joint expedition that follows transforms your understanding of what's actually happening in post-Roman Britannia. As your mixed group moves through the countryside north of Corinium, you discover that the neat categories of Roman and barbarian, civilized and savage, us and them have become increasingly meaningless. The farms you encounter have been abandoned not because of barbarian raids, but because their owners fled south when news of the wall's breach reached them. The livestock running loose in the fields, the grain rotting in storage pits, the tools scattered around empty courtyards. All of it represents wealth that's going to waste because the social systems that normally organize agricultural production have collapsed. Such waste, mutters Wulfric as your group loads wagons with abandoned grain. In my homeland, before the Huns came, no community would leave good food to spoil while people starved. His comment highlights an uncomfortable truth. The barbarian warriors participating in this expedition demonstrate better organizational skills and more practical wisdom than the Roman authorities who created the current crisis through their factional conflicts and competing demands for resources. The real confrontation comes when you encounter the source of the region's troubles, a substantial force of deserters from various Roman units who have established themselves as bandits in the ruins of what was once a prosperous villa estate. These aren't barbarian raiders or political rebels, but Roman soldiers who have concluded that military service no longer offers adequate compensation for its risks and hardships. Their leader, a former centurion named Marcus Brutus Severus, whom you recognize from garrison duty at Eboracum 3 years earlier, greets your approach with a mixture of defiance and desperate bravado. Well, if it isn't Marcus Corvus, still playing soldier for emperors who don't exist, he calls out as his men form a defensive line across the road. Come to arrest us for taking what we need to survive. Behind him, you can see the evidence of his band's activities, wagons loaded with grain and livestock, clearly taken from local farms, civilian prisoners probably being held for ransom, and weapons and equipment that suggest they've been raiding military supply convoys as well as civilian targets. Severus, you reply, keeping your voice level. You're attacking the very people you swore to protect. How is that different from what the barbarians are doing? His laugh is bitter. The difference is that we're honest about it. We don't pretend we're serving some glorious cause or defending imperial honor. We're just trying to stay alive in a world where the old rules no longer apply. The standoff that follows crystallizes all the tensions and contradictions of the current crisis. Your joint Roman-barbarian force faces off against Roman deserters who claim to be acting more rationally than those who maintain obsolete loyalties. The civilian population huddles between competing armed groups, all of whom claim to represent their interests while threatening their safety. It's Wulfric who proposes the solution that will ultimately define the new order emerging from imperial collapse. Why fight each other when we could share the land? He asks during a parley under a makeshift truce flag. Your people know how to work the farms and maintain the buildings. My people know how to defend territory and organize communities. The deserters know where supplies are hidden and which routes are safe for travel. You're talking about. You pause, struggling to find words for something that has no precedent in Roman law or military doctrine. Some kind of confederation. Romans and barbarians governing territory together. I'm talking about survival, Wulfric replies simply. The empire is finished in the north. We can either keep fighting over its corpse until we all starve, or we can build something new that actually works. The choice before you is no longer between civilization and barbarism, but between clinging to a past that no longer exists and adapting to a future that none of you fully understand. The agreement reached that evening around a communal fire built from the ruins of a Roman villa's marble columns seems almost miraculous in its simplicity. Romans, barbarians, and deserters sit together sharing bread and wine, negotiating the terms of what amounts to a new form of government for the territories around Corinium. The basic principles are pragmatic rather than ideological: shared defense responsibilities, equitable distribution of agricultural resources, and collective decision-making for issues affecting the entire community. Wulfric produces a leather map case containing detailed surveys of the local territory, information that reveals just how thoroughly the barbarian forces had prepared for their southern advance. My scouts have identified 12 major villa estates within a day's march of here, he explains, spreading the documents on a cloak beside the fire. Most are abandoned, but their agricultural infrastructure remains intact. Granaries, livestock enclosures, irrigation systems, workshops, everything needed to support substantial populations. You study the maps with the professional interest of someone trained to assess tactical terrain, but what strikes you most is their accuracy and detail. These aren't crude sketches made by raiders looking for quick plunder. They're the work of people planning permanent settlement, who understand that successful occupation requires intimate knowledge of local resources and logistics. Former centurion Severus, the deserter leader, contributes his own intelligence about the broader situation throughout the province. The provincial government in Londinium has essentially ceased to function. He reports with the matter-of-fact tone of someone presenting a military briefing. No tax collection, no judicial administration, no coordination of grain shipments. The wealthy are fleeing south to Gaul or across the Channel to safety, taking whatever portable wealth they can carry. This information confirms what you've begun to suspect: the barbarian breakthrough at Hadrian's Wall wasn't the cause of imperial collapse in Britannia, but merely the final symptom of systemic failures that had been developing for months or even years. The administrative and economic structures that held Roman civilization together had already weakened to the point where a relatively modest military defeat could trigger complete social breakdown. Over the following weeks, as the new confederation takes shape around Corinium, you witness what amounts to a controlled experiment in post-Roman governance. The results are surprisingly encouraging. Barbarian warriors, accustomed to collective decision-making in their tribal assemblies, adapt easily to councils that include Roman officials and civilian representatives. Former Roman soldiers bring organizational skills and technical knowledge that complement barbarian expertise in agriculture and animal husbandry. The most remarkable success comes in the realm of security and law enforcement. The bandit raids that had plagued the region for months virtually disappear once former deserters are integrated into legitimate military units with regular pay and clear responsibilities. Having armed groups that actually know the local terrain and population proves far more effective than traditional Roman methods of frontier patrol. It works because everyone has a stake in making it work, explains Lucilius during one of your evening walks around the perimeter of what has become an increasingly prosperous settlement. The barbarians get the settled agricultural life they wanted. The Romans get security and maintained infrastructure. The former deserters get legitimacy and regular meals. Nobody has to choose between starving honorably and surviving dishonorably. Your own role in this new order proves both challenging and strangely satisfying. Your military experience makes you a natural choice for organizing the Confederation's defense forces, but the work requires skills never covered in any Roman military manual. Instead of commanding legions trained to identical standards and equipped with uniform gear, you're coordinating warriors from different cultures who bring their own weapons, fighting techniques and concepts of military organization. The breakthrough comes when you realize that diversity of military traditions actually represents an advantage rather than a problem. Barbarian cavalry tactics prove superior to Roman methods for pursuing raiders across difficult terrain. Roman engineering skills enable the construction of defensive works that incorporate the best features of both imperial fortification design and barbarian field fortifications. The combination creates military capabilities that neither culture could have achieved alone. 3 months after the fall of Hadrian's wall, a messenger arrives from Londinium carrying news that initially seems to vindicate your decision to abandon traditional imperial loyalties. The official dispatch, bearing the seal of what claims to be the legitimate provincial government, announces that Emperor Constantine III has negotiated a general settlement with barbarian peoples throughout the northern provinces. By imperial decree, the messenger reads from an elaborately formatted scroll. All military units are hereby ordered to cease unauthorized cooperation with barbarian forces and report to designated assembly points for reorganization under proper Roman command. Civilian populations are instructed to provide full cooperation with imperial representatives engaged in restoring lawful administration. The messenger himself, however, tells a different story during private conversations away from official proceedings. "Sir, I've ridden through half the province delivering these orders. Most of the addresses on my list, forts, administrative centers, major settlements, either don't exist anymore or are controlled by people who don't recognize imperial authority. The legitimate government in Londinium controls maybe a quarter of the territory it claims to govern." More significantly, he brings intelligence about the wider situation that reveals how limited and temporary the apparent success around Corinium really is. The barbarians who broke through at the wall, that was just the first wave. There are reports of massive population movements throughout Gaul, entire tribal confederations seeking new territories, and they're not looking for temporary raiding opportunities. They're bringing their families, their livestock, their entire way of life. This information forces you to confront the uncomfortable possibility that the confederation you've helped build, successful as it has been on a local level, may be merely a brief island of stability in a much larger storm of demographic and political upheaval. The pressures that drove the initial barbarian invasions, overpopulation, climate change, political instability in their original territories haven't disappeared. If anything, the success of the early invasions is likely to encourage additional migrations that could overwhelm any defensive arrangements you've managed to establish. The apparent resolution of immediate problems around Corinium begins to seem less like a permanent solution and more like a temporary respite, a chance to catch your breath before facing even greater challenges. The new order you've helped create may represent the future of post-Roman Europe, but only if it can survive the continued pressures that destroyed the empire itself. As you stand watch on the walls of Corinium one crisp autumn evening, looking out over fields where Roman and barbarian farmers work side by side preparing for the winter harvest, you realize that everything you've achieved remains precarious, dependent on circumstances beyond anyone's control. The real test is yet to come. The illusion of stability shatters on a fog-shrouded morning in late October when Wulfric's scouts bring news that makes your blood run cold. A massive barbarian confederation, Saxons, Angles and Jutes from the northern Germanic coastlands, has landed on the eastern shores of Britannia with a fleet of over 300 ships. Unlike the relatively small groups you've learned to accommodate around Corinium, this represents a migration of perhaps 50,000 people, warriors, farmers, craftsmen, women, children and elderly, along with their livestock, tools and household goods. They're not raiders, Wulfric explains grimly, as he spreads out reports from his intelligence network across the makeshift table in what was once Corinium's basilica. My kinsmen among them sent word. They've abandoned their homeland entirely. The sea levels are rising, the soil is turning salt, and the Danes are pressing them from the north. They have nowhere to go back to. The implications are staggering. Your carefully negotiated confederation around Corinium has worked precisely because it involved manageable numbers of people sharing abundant resources. But 50,000 additional settlers, arriving with nothing but what they could carry in their ships, would strain the agricultural capacity of the entire region beyond any sustainable level. Former centurion Severus, who has become your most reliable source of intelligence about conditions throughout the province, brings even more disturbing news from his network of contacts among the deserter bands. The eastern coastal settlements are already in chaos. The Romano-British population is fleeing inland, but they're not going south toward Londinium anymore. They're coming west, toward territories they've heard are stable and secure, toward us. You climb to the highest tower of Corinium's walls and look out over the surrounding countryside, trying to calculate how many additional people the land could reasonably support. The villa estates that have been restored to productivity over the past months could probably feed their current populations through the winter, assuming normal weather and no major crop failures. But double or triple those numbers. The mathematics of survival become impossible. The refugee crisis begins within days. First come small groups of Romano-British families fleeing the Saxon landings, their wagons loaded with whatever possessions they could salvage from abandoned homes. These you can accommodate relatively easily, settling them in the outbuildings of restored villa estates where their skills in agriculture and craftsmanship actually strengthen the Confederation's capabilities. But they're followed by larger groups, then by entire communities that have decided to abandon their traditional territories rather than face conquest by the new Germanic arrivals. Within 2 weeks, the population around Corinium has nearly doubled, and the careful balance of resources and responsibilities that made your new society functional has been overwhelmed by sheer numbers. The first serious crisis comes when a group of Saxon warriors, advance scouts from the main body of migrants, arrives at Corinium demanding passage rights through your territory and access to the agricultural supplies they need to feed their own people. Their leader, a tall man named Cerdic who speaks passable Latin, presents his case with the straightforward logic of someone accustomed to making life or death decisions. We are not enemies of Romans or of the peoples who have found new homes here, he declares during a tense council meeting in the Forum. But our ships brought 30,000 of our folk to these shores, and they must eat. The lands near the coast cannot support such numbers. We need access to the interior territories where grain can be grown and livestock raised. The problem, of course, is that those same interior territories are already supporting your own confederation plus the Romano-British refugees who have sought shelter with you. There simply isn't enough agricultural surplus to feed everyone, regardless of anyone's intentions or goodwill. Wulfric attempts to negotiate some form of accommodation, proposing that the Saxons continue westward toward territories that might be less densely settled. But Cerdic's response reveals just how limited the options really are. West of here lies the kingdom of the Cornevi, who have made it clear they will resist any additional settlements in their lands. South are the territories controlled by various Roman factions, who consider all Germanic peoples to be enemies. North, he shrugs expressively. North are the lands we abandoned because they can no longer support life. We are here because we have nowhere else to go. The negotiations collapse when it becomes clear that no solution exists that can satisfy everyone's needs. The Saxon migration represents an unstoppable force driven by environmental and political pressures beyond anyone's control, while your confederation represents an immovable object in the form of people who have already found their refuge and will not willingly abandon it. The conflict that follows is unlike anything in your military experience. It's not a war in any traditional sense, with clear objectives and defined enemy forces. Instead, it's a desperate struggle for survival between two groups of people who have valid claims to the same resources and no alternative territories to retreat to. The Saxons don't attack Corinium directly. Instead, they establish camps throughout the surrounding countryside and begin systematically appropriating whatever they need to survive. Grain from storage pits, livestock from pastures, timber from managed forests, water from wells and streams. It's not conquest in the Roman sense, but rather a form of occupation that gradually displaces the existing population through competition for limited resources. Your confederation's response reveals how thoroughly your thinking has evolved beyond traditional Roman military doctrine. Instead of attempting to expel the Saxons through direct combat, which would be impossible given their numbers, you focus on protecting the most essential resources and population centers while negotiating local accommodations wherever possible. Some Romano-British villa owners reach private agreements with Saxon groups, trading agricultural expertise for protection against other raiders. Some barbarian warriors from your original confederation defect to the more numerous Saxon forces, calculating that their long-term survival prospects are better with the larger group. Some Roman soldiers simply disappear one night, probably heading south toward whatever imperial authority still exists or west toward territories not yet affected by the migrations. As winter approaches and the immediate crisis of food distribution becomes a question of who will starve and who will survive, you realize that the confederation you helped build around Corinium was never going to be a permanent solution. It was a temporary adaptation to circumstances that were themselves temporary, a brief experiment in cooperation that could only work as long as external pressures remained manageable. The real transformation isn't military or political, but demographic and cultural. The old Romano-British civilization, with its villa estates and market towns, its Latin literacy and imperial loyalties, is being absorbed into something new, a mixed population of Romans, earlier Germanic settlers, and recent Saxon migrants, all struggling to create sustainable communities in a landscape that can no longer support the elaborate hierarchy and specialized roles of imperial society. Standing in the ruins of what was once Corinium's most elegant public bath, now converted into a communal grain storage facility, you understand that you're witnessing the birth of post-Roman Britain, a society that will eventually develop its own distinctive culture but will never again resemble the orderly, prosperous province you once knew. The empire hasn't just fallen, it has been transformed into something entirely different. By the first snows of winter, a new reality has crystallized around what was once Corinium, though the settlement itself has been transformed beyond recognition. The ordered streets of the Roman town have given way to a sprawling collection of settlements that reflects the complex demographic mix now inhabiting the region. Saxon longhouses constructed from salvaged Roman timber stand alongside converted villa buildings where Romano-British families have adapted their living spaces for communal rather than private use. The emergence of this new order becomes most visible in the daily routines that have evolved to manage resource distribution and collective decision-making. Where Roman administration once relied on written orders flowing down through a hierarchical chain of command, the mixed population has developed oral assemblies that combine Germanic tribal councils with adapted Roman legal procedures. You find yourself serving as something between a military commander and a tribal elder, a role that has no precedent in traditional Roman society but which seems natural in the circumstances that now prevail. During the weekly assemblies held in what was once the basilica's central hall, you listened to disputes between farmers over water rights, debates about winter grain allocation, and proposals for organizing spring planting schedules that will need to accommodate both Roman agricultural techniques and Saxon farming practices. The old boundaries mean nothing now, explains Ulred, a Saxon chieftain who has emerged as one of the settlement's most influential leaders. Your Roman property markers, our tribal hunting grounds, the villa estate divisions, none of that helps us decide who plants what crops where. We need new ways of thinking about land use. The solution that emerges represents a genuine fusion of Roman and Germanic legal traditions. Individual ownership of agricultural land gives way to collective management by extended family groups that often include both Romano-British and Saxon members. Villa buildings are converted into communal centers where tools, livestock, and stored food are shared according to need and contribution rather than traditional property rights. Most remarkably, this transformation occurs without the violent displacement that characterized barbarian conquests elsewhere in the former empire. The population mixing around Corinium isn't the result of conquest and submission, but rather of practical accommodations reached by people who understand that their survival depends on cooperation rather than conflict. Young Lucilius, now serving as a liaison between the various ethnic groups in the settlement, brings you reports that illustrate how thoroughly social relationships have been reorganized. Centurion, Elder Marcus, you should see what's happening in the workshops. The Saxon metal workers are teaching our people new techniques for working iron, while our stonemasons are showing them how to repair the villa heating systems. The children are growing up speaking both Latin and Saxon, and some of the marriages. He pauses, clearly uncertain about how you'll react to evidence of intermarriage between Romans and barbarians. Relationships that would have been scandalous under traditional imperial law, but which have become commonplace in the new community. The marriages make sense, you tell him, realizing as you speak that your own attitudes have evolved far beyond anything you would have considered possible just months earlier. When survival depends on combining different skills and knowledge, family alliances that cross ethnic boundaries create stronger households. The winter months provide time for the new social systems to stabilize, and for you to reflect on the broader implications of what's emerging around Corinium. The settlement represents something genuinely new in European history, a post-Roman society that preserves elements of imperial civilization while incorporating Germanic social structures and agricultural practices. Latin remains the language of formal assemblies and legal proceedings, but Saxon has become equally common in daily conversation. Roman engineering expertise maintains the aqueducts and hypocaust heating systems, but Germanic woodworking techniques have proven superior for constructing the longhouses needed to accommodate extended family groups. Christian religious observances continue in the converted basilica, but they're supplemented by Germanic seasonal celebrations that reflect agricultural cycles. The most significant transformation involves concepts of authority and social hierarchy. The rigid class distinctions that characterized Roman society, citizens and non-citizens, free and slave, patrician and plebeian, have been replaced by more fluid arrangements based on practical contributions to community welfare. A Saxon warrior who proves skilled at organizing defensive patrols can achieve leadership status regardless of his origins, while a Romano-British villa owner who cannot adapt his skills to changed circumstances may find himself marginalized despite his traditional social position. Your own evolution from Roman centurion to community elder exemplifies this broader transformation. The military rank and imperial commission that once defined your identity have become largely irrelevant. replaced by leadership based on practical competence and the trust of people who care more about effective management of shared resources than about traditional credentials. The clearest evidence of the new order's stability comes when Saxon ships arrive in early spring carrying additional migrants from the Germanic coastlands. Unlike the crisis-driven conflicts of the previous autumn, these new arrivals are accommodated through established procedures that have been developed over the winter months. Community assemblies assess available resources, assign settlement locations, and integrate newcomers into existing work groups according to protocols that balance need with capacity. We've learned to manage growth instead of being overwhelmed by it. Wulfric observes during one of your regular strategic planning sessions. The key was realizing that people aren't just mouths to feed, they're also hands to work and minds to solve problems. As long as we can organize their contributions effectively, larger populations can actually create more security and prosperity rather than less. This insight represents a fundamental departure from Roman demographic thinking, which typically viewed population growth as a burden that required extensive administrative control and resource extraction to manage. The new settlement model treats human diversity as an asset, recognizing that different cultural traditions contribute different solutions to the challenges of survival and prosperity. As spring planting begins, and you watch mixed teams of Romano-British and Saxon farmers preparing fields using the best techniques from both traditions, you realize that the world emerging from imperial collapse isn't necessarily worse than what preceded it. Different, certainly, and lacking the monumental grandeur that characterized Roman civilization at its peak, but potentially more adaptive, more inclusive, and more resilient in the face of the environmental and demographic pressures that destroyed the empire itself. The new order around Corinium represents one possible future for post-Roman Europe, not a return to primitive barbarism, but rather the evolution of hybrid societies that combine the best elements of both imperial and tribal traditions while developing innovative solutions to unprecedented challenges. For the first time since the fall of Hadrian's Wall, you feel something approaching optimism about what comes next. The arrival of refugees from the south during the late spring of your second year in the Corinium settlement brings news that forces you to confront the wider scope of the transformation sweeping across what was once the Roman world. These aren't the familiar Romano-British families fleeing Saxon coastal settlements, but rather a more diverse group that includes Gallic merchants, Germanic auxiliaries who served in the Rhine legions, and even a few officials who claim to represent something called the Soissons Enclave, apparently the last functioning remnant of imperial administration in northern Gaul. The leader of this refugee group is a man who identifies himself as Tribunus Gaius Aemilius Syagrius, though his worn equipment and exhausted followers suggest that whatever authority he once possessed has been severely diminished by circumstances. During the formal assembly called to hear his testimony about conditions beyond Britannia, he paints a picture of continental Europe that makes your own experiences seem almost fortunate by comparison. The Rhine frontier has ceased to exist. He reports with the hollow voice of someone who has witnessed the collapse of everything he believed permanent, not just breached but abandoned. Colonia Agrippina, Mogontiacum, Argentoratum, all the great fortress cities are now barbarian settlements. The Franks control the lower Rhine, the Alemanni dominate the middle regions, and the Burgundians have established their own kingdom in the upper valleys. But it's his description of the social transformation accompanying these territorial changes that most clearly illuminates the broader patterns of which your Corinium experiment represents just one local example. Throughout Gaul, he explains, the collapse of imperial administration has triggered not just political fragmentation but fundamental changes in how human communities organize themselves. The villa estates that survived the initial invasions have mostly been converted into something resembling Germanic manor halls. Syagrius continues. The original Roman owners either fled south or learned to accommodate barbarian overlords. But here's what's remarkable. Many of these hybrid settlements are actually more prosperous than they were under imperial rule, without the burden of imperial taxes and military requisitions, with direct access to barbarian trade networks, and with agricultural techniques that combine Roman efficiency with Germanic innovation. They're producing surplus wealth for the first time in generations. This information confirms patterns you've observed around Corinium, but extends them across the entire former northwestern frontier of the empire. The barbarian invasions haven't simply destroyed Roman civilization. They've catalyzed its evolution into new forms that may actually be better adapted to current environmental and economic conditions. A Gallic merchant named Quintus Lucilius Maximus, who has traveled extensively throughout the former imperial territories during the past 2 years, provides even more detailed intelligence about these transformation processes. His testimony reveals that similar hybrid societies have emerged across a vast geographical area, each adapting Roman and barbarian elements according to local circumstances and population mixes. In the Burgundian territories, he reports, they've maintained Roman legal codes but adapted them to accommodate Germanic concepts of tribal law. Property disputes are resolved by mixed tribunals that include both Roman jurisprudence and barbarian elders. The result is a legal system that's more flexible and responsive to local needs than imperial law ever was. His descriptions of economic arrangements in post-Roman Gaul particularly fascinate you because they mirror developments you've encouraged around Corinium. Trade hasn't collapsed, it's been reorganized. Instead of goods flowing toward imperial administrative centers for taxation and redistribution, regional networks have developed that connect agricultural producers directly with urban consumers. The Frankish kingdoms are actually exporting grain to regions of the Mediterranean that were traditionally surplus producers. Most significantly, the merchants' reports suggest that the transformation of Roman Europe isn't an isolated phenomenon confined to the barbarian-occupied territories. Even in regions that remain under nominal imperial control, administrative and economic systems are evolving in response to the same pressures that drove political collapse in the frontier provinces. The Roman territories of southern Gaul and northern Spain are Roman mostly in name, Maximus explains. Local landowners make their own arrangements for defense and resource management. They may acknowledge distant emperors and pay occasional tribute, but their daily lives are governed by regional strongmen who operate more like barbarian chieftains than imperial officials. This information forces you to reconsider your understanding of what has actually happened to the Roman Empire. Rather than simply falling to barbarian conquest, it appears to have undergone a comprehensive structural transformation that has affected even territories that haven't experienced direct military occupation. The centralized administrative state that characterized imperial government has been replaced by decentralized arrangements that rely more on local authority and regional accommodation. During the evening discussions that follow the refugee testimonies, Wulfric raises the crucial question that ties these broader patterns to your own situation. If these changes are happening everywhere, what does that mean for our future here? Are we building something temporary that will eventually be absorbed into larger barbarian kingdoms, or are we creating a model that could influence how post-Roman societies develop? The question proves impossible to answer definitively, but the evidence suggests that the Corinium settlement represents one example of a new type of European society that's emerging from the ruins of imperial structure. These hybrid communities, combining Roman organizational expertise with barbarian social flexibility, may actually be better equipped to deal with the demographic and environmental challenges of the post-imperial world than either pure Roman or pure barbarian societies. former centurion Severus, whose network of contacts among deserter groups throughout Britannia provides intelligence about conditions across the island, brings reports that support this interpretation. Similar mixed settlements are developing around Eboracum Diva and even in the territories north of the Old Wall. Everywhere you find populations under pressure, you're seeing the emergence of these hybrid arrangements. It's not just happening here, it's a general pattern. As you listen to these reports and try to understand their implications for the future of the settlement you've helped build, you realize that you've been participating in something far more significant than a local accommodation between Romans and barbarians. You've been part of a continent-wide transformation that's creating the foundations of medieval European civilization. The Roman Empire may have fallen, but the synthesis of imperial and barbarian traditions that's emerging from its ruins represents something new and potentially more durable than what preceded it. Your own evolution from Roman centurion to community elder reflects a broader process that's reshaping human society across the former imperial territories. The world being born from the empire's collapse may not resemble the classical civilization you once served, but it's proving remarkably adaptive to the challenges that destroyed that earlier order. 5 years have passed since you first stood on Hadrian's wall watching barbarian warbands advance across the northern moors, and the settlement that has grown around Corinium now hosts its first formal school, a modest building constructed from salvaged Roman stones where children learn to read Latin texts while also receiving instruction in Saxon oral traditions and practical skills like metalworking and animal husbandry. The fusion of educational traditions exemplifies how thoroughly Roman cultural elements have been preserved and transformed within the new social order. The school's establishment was proposed by Elgiva, a Saxon woman whose grandfather had been a tribal scop, a keeper of oral history, and whose own children are now among the first generation to grow up fully bilingual in Latin and Germanic dialects. During the community assembly that approved the project, she articulated something that has become central to the settlement's identity, the recognition that cultural knowledge represents a form of wealth that increases rather than diminishes when shared between different traditions. Our children need to understand the Roman way of organizing information, she argued with the eloquence that has made her one of the settlement's most respected voices. Because written records allow knowledge to survive beyond the memory of any individual. But they also need to learn our ways of preserving wisdom in songs and stories. Because spoken traditions carry emotional truths that scratches on parchment cannot capture. You find yourself teaching in this school several days each week, sharing military engineering knowledge with boys and girls who may never serve in anything resembling a traditional Roman legion, but who can use hydraulic principles to improve irrigation systems and apply fortification design to protect their communities. The irony isn't lost on you. Roman military doctrine developed to conquer and control barbarian peoples is now being taught to barbarian children as part of their preparation for building a better society. But the school represents more than just educational innovation. It symbolizes the settlement's commitment to cultural continuity across generations and ethnic boundaries. The children attending classes include not only the sons and daughters of your original Roman barbarian confederation, but also refugees from across the former imperial territories, each bringing their own linguistic and cultural traditions to add to the community's growing synthesis. Young Marcus Britannicus, the son of a Romano-British villa owner and a Saxon craftswoman, exemplifies this new generation. Equally comfortable reading Virgil in Latin and reciting Germanic heroic poetry, trained in both Roman agricultural techniques and Saxon woodland management, he represents something genuinely unprecedented in European history. a person whose cultural identity transcends the ethnic categories that once defined social and political boundaries. The preservation of Roman legal traditions within the settlement's governing structures provides another example of how imperial heritage continues to influence post-Roman society. The weekly assemblies still follow procedures adapted from Roman municipal law, with formal presentations of evidence, structured debate, and recorded decisions. But these procedures now accommodate Germanic concepts of collective responsibility and restorative justice that often produce more practical solutions to community problems than pure Roman legalism would allow. "We keep what works and adapt what doesn't," explains Decurion Maximus, formerly of the auxiliary cavalry, now serving as the settlement's chief administrator during one of your regular reviews of community policies. Roman law is excellent for resolving property disputes and commercial disagreements, but Germanic customary law handles family conflicts and personal injuries more effectively. Why not use both? This pragmatic approach to cultural inheritance has enabled the settlement to develop institutional frameworks that are simultaneously familiar to people from Roman backgrounds and acceptable to those from barbarian traditions. The result is a legal system that provides stability and predictability while remaining flexible enough to evolve with changing circumstances. The most visible symbol of cultural continuity lies in the settlement's architectural evolution. The original Roman buildings, basilica, baths, forum, have been maintained and adapted rather than abandoned or destroyed. The basilica now serves as both a Christian church and a community meeting hall, its classical columns supporting a roof modified with Germanic carpentry techniques. The public baths operate on a reduced scale but continue to provide communal bathing facilities that serve important social functions for the mixed population. New construction in the settlement reflects the same synthetic approach. Saxon longhouses are built using Roman engineering principles that make them more durable and efficient, while Roman-style villa modifications incorporate Germanic innovations in heating and food storage. The overall effect is an architectural landscape that preserves classical proportions and decorative elements while serving the practical needs of a society organized along very different lines from traditional imperial communities. The settlement's economic networks provide perhaps the most important example of how Roman commercial traditions have been preserved and extended within post-imperial arrangements. The regional trading relationships that you helped establish during the early years of the Confederation have evolved into extensive commercial networks that span much of former Roman Britannia and extend across the Channel to similar hybrid communities in Gaul. These trade networks operate according to principles that combine Roman commercial law with Germanic gift exchange customs, creating economic relationships that are both profitable and socially stabilizing. Rather than the extraction-based commerce that characterized imperial trade, where resources flowed toward political centers for redistribution, the new arrangements emphasize reciprocal exchange between autonomous communities that strengthens political as well as economic ties. "We're actually more prosperous now than we were under imperial rule," observes Lucilius, who has become the settlement's chief merchant and maintains correspondence with trading partners throughout the former empire. "Without imperial taxes and military requisitions draining our surplus production, we can invest in improvements that actually benefit our own community. The roads we maintain, the storage facilities we build, the workshops we establish, they all serve our needs directly rather than supporting some distant administrative center." His observation highlights one of the most significant aspects of the settlement's success: the way it has managed to preserve and adapt the technical and organizational achievements of Roman civilization while eliminating the extractive and hierarchical elements that ultimately made imperial rule unsustainable. The community enjoys the benefits of classical engineering, legal traditions and agricultural techniques without the burden of supporting a massive bureaucratic and military apparatus designed primarily to maintain elite dominance. As you walk through the settlement on a warm summer evening, watching children play games that blend Roman and Germanic traditions while their parents discuss harvest planning in conversations that switch effortlessly between Latin and Saxon, you realize that you're witnessing something remarkable. The successful preservation of what was valuable in Roman civilization within a social framework that has proven more adaptive and durable than the empire itself. The legacy of Rome lives on, not as a political or military force, but as a cultural inheritance that continues to enrich human society long after the imperial structures that created it have been transformed beyond recognition. As you sit in what was once the private study of a Roman villa owner, now converted into your own modest quarters within the communal longhouse that has become your home, you find yourself contemplating a question that would have seemed meaningless during your years of military service. What does it actually mean for an empire to fall? The scrolls and wax tablets scattered across your wooden desk, reports from trading partners, letters from other settlements, records of community decisions represent a form of continuity that transcends any particular political arrangement. The documents themselves tell a story that defies simple narratives of collapse and barbarization. A letter from former tribune Syagrius, now serving as an administrator in the Soissons enclave, describes legal reforms that blend Roman jurisprudence with Frankish customary law. A trading agreement with settlements along the Rhine outlines commercial arrangements that maintain classical contract principles while accommodating Germanic concepts of kinship obligation. A report from Saxon territories in eastern Britannia details agricultural innovations that combine Roman engineering with barbarian farming techniques to achieve productivity levels that exceed what either tradition could accomplish alone. These aren't the documents of a fallen civilization, but rather the working papers of societies that are consciously preserving and adapting the most valuable elements of imperial heritage while discarding aspects that no longer serve practical purposes. The transformation you've witnessed and participated in represents something far more complex than the simple replacement of Roman order with barbarian chaos. During your evening walks around the settlement's perimeter, a habit maintained from your military days but now serving contemplative rather than security purposes, you often encounter Wulfric engaged in similar reflections. The Saxon war leader has become something of a philosopher in his middle age, and your conversations have evolved into discussions that explore the deeper patterns underlying the changes you've both experienced. I've been thinking about the stories my grandfather told about the old days in our homeland. He says during one such conversation, as you both pause to watch the sunset paint the western hills in shades of gold and crimson, he always spoke of the time before the Huns came as a golden age when our people lived in harmony with the land and each other. But when I compare his descriptions with what we've built here, I wonder if that golden age was really as perfect as memory makes it seem. His observation touches on something you've noticed about how all the ethnic groups in the settlement remember their pre-migration histories. Romans recall the empire's glory days, Saxons remember idealized tribal homelands, even the various refugee populations carry nostalgic stories about the prosperity and security they enjoyed before current troubles began. Yet the hybrid society that has emerged around Corinium demonstrates capabilities and achievements that may actually exceed what any of these groups accomplished in their supposed golden ages. Perhaps you suggest the real golden age is something we create rather than something we lose. Maybe the stories about perfect societies in the past are less important as historical records than as inspiration for building better communities in the present. This insight has gradually become central to your understanding of what the settlement represents. Rather than a desperate accommodation between the survivors of a collapsed civilization and the inheritors of a victorious barbarism, the community around Corinium embodies a conscious effort to synthesize the best elements of different cultural traditions, while avoiding the weaknesses that made those traditions vulnerable to disruption. The synthesis isn't perfect, of course. Tensions still arise between different ethnic groups, economic disputes still require resolution, and external pressures still threaten the community's security and prosperity. But the frameworks that have evolved for addressing these challenges prove remarkably effective precisely because they draw upon multiple traditions of problem solving and social organization. Your own transformation from Roman centurion to community elder exemplifies the personal dimensions of this broader social evolution. The military skills and organizational knowledge that defined your identity during your imperial service remain relevant and valuable, but they've been supplemented by diplomatic capabilities, agricultural expertise, and cultural sensitivity that were never part of traditional Roman military training. You've become more competent and useful as a community leader than you ever were as an imperial officer, not despite the fall of Rome, but because of the opportunities that collapse created for personal growth and adaptation. The children of the settlement, now approaching adulthood after growing up entirely within the post-imperial world, demonstrate even more dramatic examples of this synthetic development. They possess technical skills that combine Roman engineering knowledge with barbarian craftsmanship, linguistic abilities that enable communication across ethnic boundaries, and social perspectives that treat cultural diversity as a source of strength rather than conflict. These young people represent something genuinely new in European history, a generation whose identity isn't constrained by the ethnic and political categories that defined previous eras. As winter approaches and you prepare for the settlement's sixth harvest celebration, an event that has evolved into a festival blending Roman religious observances with Germanic seasonal traditions, you find yourself thinking about the question of historical inevitability. Was the fall of the Western Roman Empire an unavoidable consequence of internal contradictions and external pressures, or could different decisions and circumstances have preserved imperial unity? More importantly, was the emergence of hybrid post-imperial societies like your own settlement a predictable outcome of imperial collapse, or merely a fortunate accident that occurred in a few favorable locations? The evidence suggests that both the empire's fall and the subsequent emergence of synthetic societies reflected deeper historical forces that transcended any individual decisions or local circumstances. The demographic pressures driving barbarian migrations, the environmental changes affecting agricultural productivity, the economic strains created by maintaining extensive military and administrative systems, all of these represented structural challenges that required fundamental rather than cosmetic responses. The Roman Empire, for all its achievements, had become too rigid and hierarchical to adapt effectively to these challenges. The barbarian societies pressing against imperial frontiers possessed greater flexibility, but lacked the technical and organizational capabilities needed to manage complex civilizations. The hybrid communities emerging from their interaction represent evolutionary adaptations that combine the strengths of both traditions while avoiding their respective weaknesses. Your settlement around Corinium may be small and relatively isolated, but it embodies principles of social organization that appear to be emerging independently across the former imperial territories. The future of European civilization may well depend on the success of such experiments in cultural synthesis and adaptive governance. As you extinguish the oil lamp in your study and prepare for sleep, you realize that the question of whether Rome truly fell may be less important than the question of what has risen from its transformation. The empire as a political entity has certainly disappeared, but the imperial legacy lives on in new forms that may prove more durable and beneficial than the original.